The sun was setting over the quiet suburban neighborhood of Maplewood Estates, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and perfectly aligned mailboxes. It was the kind of place where everything looked pristine on the surface, but beneath the facade of order and harmony, a storm was brewing. A storm that would soon expose the dark underbelly of power, control, and corruption. At the center of this storm was a man named Daniel Harper. A retired Army veteran, Daniel had seen his fair share of battles, but nothing could have prepared him for the war he was about to wage in his own backyard. Daniel had always been a man of principle, someone who believed in standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. And now, as he stood on his property, staring at the notice taped to his front door, he knew that principle was about to be tested like never before. The notice fluttered slightly in the cool autumn breeze, its bold letters glaring at him like an accusation. Immediate action required. Violation notice. RV parked illegally. Daniel almost laughed. Almost. The absurdity of the situation was almost too much to comprehend. He didn't live in an HOA. He had specifically bought this piece of land to avoid the petty rules and overreaching authority of homeowners associations. Yet here he was, holding a $500 fine issued by none other than Margaret Maggie Whitaker, the self-proclaimed queen of Maplewood Estates and president of the Maplewood HOA. Daniel glanced over at his RV, the same one that had been parked on his property for the past 2 years. It wasn't just an RV to him. It was a sanctuary, a home for 3 disabled veterans who had served their country with honor and were now struggling to rebuild their lives. Daniel had been renting the space to them at next to nothing because he believed in taking care of those who had sacrificed so much. And now Maggie had the audacity to call it an eyesore. According to her letter, the RV was lowering property values and violating the community's aesthetic guidelines. Guidelines that didn't even apply to Daniel's property. He crumpled the paper in his fist, his stomach churning not with fear, but with sheer irritation. This wasn't about an RV. This was about control. The kind of control that people like Maggie thrived on. Daniel had always been a thorn in Maggie's side. He refused to attend HOA meetings, ignored her ridiculous rules about mailbox colors and lawn decorations, and generally lived his life as he saw fit. Maggie, on the other hand, was the kind of person who needed to control everything and everyone around her. She had turned the HOA into her personal fiefdom, issuing fines like royal decrees and crushing anyone who dared to challenge her authority. And now, she had set her sights on Daniel. The first salvo. Daniel decided to handle the situation calmly, at least at first. He dialed the HOA office, fully expecting to speak to some underpaid assistant who would clear up the misunderstanding. Instead, Maggie answered the phone herself, her voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "I was wondering when you'd call," she said, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "Maggie," Daniel began, forcing himself to stay calm. "You know my property isn't under HOA jurisdiction, right?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a slow exhale. "That's a common misconception," she said sweetly. "Your property is adjacent to HOA land, and we've recently revised our bylaws to include aesthetic standards for all visible structures." Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. "That's not how property laws work, Maggie." "Well," she said, her tone turning mocking, "you can always appeal it at the next HOA meeting." "Oh wait, you never come to those." Daniel gritted his teeth. "Because I'm not in the HOA. Then you shouldn't have a problem ignoring the fine, right?" she said, her voice saccharine. "Unless, of course, you're worried about the legal action we'll have to take if you refuse to comply." Legal action over an RV? Daniel's gut told him she wasn't bluffing. He knew Maggie well enough to realize she had something planned. He just didn't know what. Not yet. Gathering the troops. Daniel wasn't about to let Maggie push him around. He gathered his paperwork, the property deed, zoning maps, and every legal document he had proving that his land was not and never had been under HOA jurisdiction. He made copies and marched over to the HOA office, which conveniently operated out of Maggie's oversized, perfectly manicured house. He knocked hard on the door, and seconds later, it swung open to reveal Maggie in all her self-important glory. Her platinum blonde bob was perfectly styled, and she wore a cardigan draped over her shoulders like a queen's robe. That signature smirk of hers made Daniel's blood boil. "Ah," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "I figured you'd be by." Daniel didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Maggie, I brought documentation proving that my property is not part of your HOA. This fine is invalid, and I expect it to be rescinded immediately." She let out a little laugh, as if he were a child throwing a tantrum. "Oh, sweetheart," she cooed. "You're misunderstanding the situation. Even though your land isn't technically part of our HOA, our new bylaw revision includes visible properties that impact the overall aesthetic of our community. Your RV is visible from the street, so it falls under our jurisdiction." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "That's not how laws work, Maggie. You don't get to change your little rulebook and suddenly decide it applies to me." She shrugged, completely unfazed. "You'll have to take that up with our legal team." That was the moment Daniel knew Maggie wasn't just bluffing. She was daring him to challenge her, counting on the fact that most people back down when faced with the bureaucratic nightmare of an HOA's legal team. Unfortunately for her, Daniel wasn't most people. "Fine," he said, his voice calm even as anger simmered beneath his skin. "I'll have my attorney reach out." Her smirk faltered just slightly. "Oh, you have a lawyer?" "Of course," Daniel lied. "And if this fine isn't dropped, you'll be hearing from him very soon." He turned and walked away before she could respond, keeping his back straight and his steps measured. But inside, he was fuming. He had expected some pushback, but this? Maggie was making up rules on the fly, twisting laws that didn't even apply to him, and expecting him to just roll over and accept it. That wasn't going to happen. The battle begins. Back home, Daniel got to work. He contacted a real lawyer, an old buddy from college named Marcus Reynolds who specialized in property law. When Daniel explained the situation, Marcus actually laughed. "She thinks she can enforce HOA rules on non-HOA properties. That's not just overreach, that's borderline harassment." "Yeah, well, she's not backing down," Daniel said. "Good," Marcus replied. "Neither will we. First step, a formal cease and desist letter. That'll put her on notice that her little power trip won't fly." The next morning, Daniel sent Maggie a beautifully worded legal notice, courtesy of Marcus, informing her that her attempts to enforce HOA regulations on a non-HOA property were illegal and that any further harassment would be met with legal action. He even hand-delivered it, just for the satisfaction of seeing the look on her face. She read it, her expression shifting from amusement to annoyance. "This," she said, shaking the paper, "doesn't scare me." "Good," Daniel shot back. "Because if you don't back off, the next thing you get will be a lawsuit." He thought that would be the end of it. He thought Maggie would finally realize she was messing with the wrong person. But he underestimated her obsession with power. The war escalates. Later that week, Daniel received another notice. This time, it wasn't just a fine. It was an official final warning stating that if his RV wasn't removed within 30 days, the HOA would take appropriate action to ensure compliance. Daniel wasn't entirely sure what appropriate action meant, but he had a sinking feeling that Maggie wasn't done playing games. And this time, she was coming with everything she had. The first sign that things were about to get worse wasn't the second fine or even the official sounding final warning. It was the fact that Maggie had started to watch his property. Not casually, not like a concerned neighbor who happened to notice something, but intentionally, invasively, and borderline obsessively. She would drive by his house at odd hours, her white Lexus creeping past like a shark circling prey. She wasn't alone, either. A few of her HOA lackeys, retired men with nothing better to do than police their neighbors' flower beds, started showing up, standing at the edge of his property line, whispering to each other while pretending to check their mail or walk their dogs. It was laughable at first, but then the complaints started. A slow trickle at first, a letter in his mailbox from the county zoning office claiming an anonymous complaint had been filed about his RV violating local ordinances. A notice from the health department alleging his property might have a waste disposal issue due to the RV hookups. Another anonymous report. Then, one day, a tow truck showed up unannounced. The driver looked confused as he glanced between Daniel's RV and his paperwork. "You call for a tow?" he asked, scratching his head. "No," Daniel said, stepping outside. "Who sent you?" The driver looked at his clipboard. "Homeowners Association. Said there was an unauthorized vehicle on HOA property that needed removal." Daniel nearly laughed in disbelief. "This isn't HOA property." The guy sighed, clearly irritated. "Look, man, I don't care what your beef is with them. They paid for the tow, and I've got a job to do." No, you don't, Daniel shot back. Because if you touch my RV, that's trespassing and grand theft. The tow truck driver held up his hands. Hey, I don't want trouble. If you're saying this is private property, I'll confirm with dispatch. He pulled out his phone, stepping away to make a call. Moments later, he returned with a look of irritation. Dispatch says the HOA insists this is their jurisdiction, but I don't like getting into the middle of this stuff. I'm just going to bounce. That was strike one for Maggie. Strike two came a few days later when one of the veterans Daniel housed in the RV, Jim, a retired Marine with a prosthetic leg, walked up to him, frustration written all over his face. Some woman just came by, he said, his jaw tight. Asked me when we were moving out. Daniel frowned. Who? Didn't say. Blonde, middle-aged, drove a Lexus. Maggie, Daniel said, his anger rising. She spoke to you? Jim nodded. Told her to get lost. She wasn't happy. Daniel saw red. It was one thing to harass him. He was used to dealing with power-hungry bureaucrats. But going after the men he was trying to help? That was a whole different level of scum. So, Daniel did something he knew would push Maggie over the edge. He made his veterans visible. Up until now, the men had kept to themselves. They were quiet, respectful. But after Maggie's stunt, Daniel encouraged them to use his front yard however they pleased. Lawn chairs came out, a grill was set up, and every evening, they gathered outside, laughing, swapping stories, and enjoying their lives. And every evening, Maggie's car would slow down as she drove past, her disgust barely concealed. The final straw. Strike three happened one night around 1 a.m. A loud bang echoed through Daniel's property. He bolted outside, his heart pounding, to find his mailbox in pieces, shattered across his driveway like someone had taken a bat to it. A coward's move. Daniel called the police, not expecting much, but an officer showed up, took some photos, and shrugged. No cameras, no witnesses. It's going to be hard to prove who did this. Daniel didn't need proof. He knew it was Maggie. But the final straw came the next morning when he found an official-looking notice taped to his front door. He expected another fake fine. Instead, it was something worse, an eviction notice. Daniel stared at the paper, his brain struggling to process what he was reading. Maggie had filed a formal complaint with the county, alleging his RV was an illegal domicile violating zoning laws. The notice claimed that if he didn't cease all habitation activities within 14 days, his property would be in violation of city ordinances and subject to forced removal. This wasn't just HOA harassment anymore. This was war. And Maggie had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The turning point. Daniel knew he had to act fast. He contacted Marcus again, who assured him they had a strong case for harassment, defamation, and possibly even fraudulent reporting to the city. But Daniel didn't stop there. He reached out to a friend who worked at a local news station and a veterans advocacy group. Within 48 hours, the situation had flipped entirely. A news crew showed up at Daniel's property, cameras rolling as they interviewed him and the veterans living in his RV. Jim, the Marine with a prosthetic leg, spoke candidly about how this place had given him stability after struggling with homelessness. Another vet, Carlos, talked about how he had PTSD and how the quiet space here had helped him more than any city-run shelter ever could. Then came the bombshell moment, live on camera. Daniel held up his property deed, zoning approval documents, and a copy of the bogus eviction notice Maggie had posted on his door. This is illegal, he said, staring into the camera, his voice steady. This is a lie. And it's not just about me. This is about power. Power-hungry HOA officials thinking they can bully people out of their homes just because they don't like how they look. We're not going anywhere. By the time the news segment aired that evening, Daniel's phone was blowing up. The veterans group he contacted had already started a social media campaign, tagging the local government and calling for an investigation into the HOA's practices. The city council, suddenly very interested in whether Maggie had abused legal channels to file false complaints, launched an official inquiry. And Maggie? She was starting to panic. The fall of the Queen. The next morning, something incredible happened. Maggie showed up at Daniel's house, not with a fine, not with another letter, but in person, standing at the edge of his driveway like she was debating whether to step foot onto his property. She didn't look as smug now. We need to talk, she said, her voice tight. Daniel crossed his arms, leaning casually against the side of his RV. Oh, About what? Her jaw clenched. You're making this into something bigger than it needs to be. Daniel let out a short laugh. Maggie, you made this bigger than it needed to be the moment you tried to evict veterans from their home just because you don't like the way it looks. She exhaled sharply through her nose. The HOA is considering withdrawing the complaint with the city. Oh, now she wants to negotiate, Daniel said, shaking his head. No, see, that's not how this works. You don't get to call off your attack and expect everything to go back to normal. The damage is done. She bristled. Damage? Daniel gestured toward his RV, where Jim and Carlos were sitting outside, drinking coffee and watching this unfold like it was prime entertainment. You humiliated yourself, Maggie. The news ran the story. The city council is looking into your HOA, and I'm willing to bet your little buddies on the HOA board are terrified of what happens next. Her face was turning red. We just want this to end. I want this to end too, Daniel said, leaning forward slightly. But here's the difference, Maggie. When this ends, I'm going to make sure the HOA is never able to pull this kind of stunt again. The muscles in her jaw worked as she ground her teeth. For the first time, she wasn't the one in control. And she hated it. Fine, she snapped. But you'd better hope the city agrees with you. She turned on her heel and stormed off. Daniel let her go because he knew what was coming next. Maggie had picked a fight she couldn't win, and now it was time to take her down for good. The aftermath. The morning after Maggie's failed attempt at a truce, the first domino fell. An official letter from the city arrived, not for Daniel, but for the HOA. It was a request for compliance documentation, zoning adherence reports, and financial records related to HOA fines issued over the past 5 years. In other words, the city was officially investigating them. Maggie must have felt the pressure because she did something desperate. She tried to rally the neighborhood against Daniel. Within hours of receiving the letter, a printed notice was stuffed into every mailbox on his street. The title read, "Protect Our Community. Stop the Unlawful Encampment." Encampment. That was the word she used to describe Daniel's property, to describe the men who had fought for this country, who had bled for it, who had come home with scars that could never fully heal. The letter was filled with the usual HOA nonsense, how Daniel's RV was lowering property values, how the integrity of the community was being threatened, how if the city sided with Daniel, it would set a dangerous precedent allowing people to turn their homes into trailer parks. It was a dog whistle, and Daniel knew exactly what she was trying to do. What she didn't anticipate was the backlash. That evening, Daniel hosted a barbecue on his front lawn, an open invitation for the neighborhood to come and meet the veterans Maggie was so desperate to demonize. He had expected a small turnout, maybe a handful of people curious enough to see what the fuss was about. Instead, half the neighborhood showed up. They listened as Jim told stories about his service, about the night his convoy was hit by an IED and he lost his leg. They nodded solemnly as Carlos explained how he struggled with PTSD, how finding stable housing had given him a sense of normalcy he hadn't felt in years. And one by one, Maggie's support crumbled. People started talking. A couple down the street mentioned how Maggie had fined them for having the wrong shade of blue on their front door. Another neighbor complained about how she had forced an elderly woman to remove her wheelchair ramp because it didn't meet community aesthetic standards. A man revealed that Maggie had been using HOA funds to pay for board member appreciation dinners at expensive restaurants, something that was definitely not in the HOA budget. The more people talked, the angrier they got. And then came the breaking point. A retired attorney who lived 2 houses down from Daniel spoke up. He had been on the fence about the situation until he saw that encampment letter Maggie had distributed. "That's defamation," he said, holding up the letter. "And if she's willing to do this to you, imagine what else she's done." That was when Daniel realized Maggie wasn't just going to lose this fight. She was going to lose everything. The final blow. The very next morning, a petition started circulating, an official request to remove Maggie as HOA president. It needed signatures from 60% of homeowners in the association to be valid. By noon, they had over 70%. By that evening, they were drafting a formal notice for her resignation. But the real blow came when the city announced their findings. Turns out, Maggie's newly revised HOA bylaws, the ones she claimed allowed her to find Daniel and try to seize his RV, weren't just overreaching. They were illegal. The city ruled that the HOA had been operating outside of its legal jurisdiction issuing fines and enforcing rules on properties that were not legally part of the association. Not only was Daniel's fine officially voided, but every fine the HOA had issued for the past 3 years was now under scrutiny. That meant thousands of dollars in fines, possibly hundreds of thousands, might have to be repaid to homeowners. The HOA board members panicked. They scrambled to hold an emergency meeting, desperate to cover their tracks. But it was too late. The city's decision was final. And Maggie? She disappeared for 2 days. No one saw her. No smug Lexus crawling down the street. No HOA notices, nothing. And then, on the 3rd day, she resurfaced, standing in front of the neighborhood meeting, looking as if she hadn't slept in days. "I am officially resigning as president of the HOA," she announced, her voice devoid of its usual arrogance. The room erupted into cheers. But even as she tried to slink away, she wasn't off the hook yet. Because the city wasn't just dissolving her bogus bylaw changes. They were launching a full-scale audit of the HOA's finances. And if the rumors were true, if Maggie had really been using HOA funds for personal expenses, then she wasn't just looking at public humiliation. She was looking at criminal charges. And that was exactly what she deserved. Epilogue. Karen had spent years ruling over the neighborhood like some self-appointed queen, issuing fines like royal decrees, weaponizing the HOA as her personal enforcers, and crushing anyone who dared to question her authority. But now, the castle was burning, and there was no one left to put out the flames. After her resignation, the HOA board crumbled almost overnight. With the city's audit in full swing, homeowners were demanding answers. Where had all their money gone? Why were they paying for landscaping projects that never seemed to happen? Why were thousands of dollars allocated to community maintenance when their roads were filled with potholes and their parks were neglected? And the answer? Maggie. The financial records, once closely guarded under the pretense of board discretion, revealed the truth. Maggie had been embezzling HOA funds for years. She had been charging business expenses to the HOA account, dinners, spa treatments, hotel stays, even first-class flights to conferences that never existed. The records showed lavish outings disguised as board meetings, payments made to fake vendors, and thousands of dollars spent at high-end boutiques for office supplies. When the city council caught wind of this, they forwarded everything to the district attorney. And just like that, Maggie's problems escalated from public humiliation to legal consequences. The cherry on top? A civil lawsuit was filed against her by the very people she had ruled over, homeowners who were demanding their stolen money back. The lawsuit gained traction fast, and once word spread, even former residents who had been victimized by her ridiculous fines joined in. Maggie was sinking, and she knew it. But in a move so stupidly predictable, she tried one last desperate attack on Daniel. Late one night, well after midnight, Daniel was woken up by the sound of screeching tires in front of his house. At first, he thought maybe a car had broken down. But then he heard shouting, a woman's voice, loud and filled with pure venom. Maggie. Daniel stepped onto his porch just in time to see her, furious and wild-eyed, standing in his driveway like some vengeful ghost. Her car door was still open, the engine running, headlights casting eerie shadows across the yard. "This is your fault," she shrieked, her voice echoing through the night. "You ruined everything." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, arms crossed, watching her unravel in real time. "My house is going up for sale," she continued, spitting the words like they physically hurt her. "My name is everywhere. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Daniel tilted his head. "You did this, Maggie." She sputtered, caught off guard. "Excuse me." Daniel gestured toward the street, toward the homes of the very people who had turned against her. "You spent years stealing from these people. You spent years bullying this neighborhood, treating everyone like your own personal subjects. The only difference now? You finally got caught." Her eyes blazed. "I was doing what was best for this community." Daniel laughed, actually laughed. "Maggie, you tried to evict disabled veterans just because you didn't like the way my RV looked. You filed false complaints with the city. You embezzled HOA funds. The only person you were ever looking out for was yourself." She took a step forward, fist clenched. "I should sue you for slander." Daniel smiled. "Maggie, I have lawyers now." That shut her up. Her face twisted, her jaw clenched so tight Daniel thought she might break a tooth. She stood there, trembling, rage practically pouring off her, until finally, she let out a frustrated scream, turned on her heel, and stormed back to her car. And as she sped off into the night, tires screeching, Daniel knew that was the last time she would ever try to threaten him. The end of an era. The next day, the HOA held a final emergency vote. With no leadership, no funds, and half the neighborhood openly demanding its dissolution, the decision was made. The HOA was officially disbanded. No more fines. No more Maggie. No more HOA. And just like that, she lost everything. Her position, gone. Her power, gone. Her house, put on the market within a week. Foreclosure pending. Maggie had spent years terrorizing the neighborhood, thinking she was untouchable. But now, she was just another disgraced fraud, desperately trying to escape the consequences of her own actions. And for the first time in years, the neighborhood was finally free. A new beginning. The dust settled quickly after Maggie's spectacular downfall. With the HOA officially dissolved, the neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. The pointless fines stopped, the threats disappeared, and for the first time in years, people actually felt free in their own homes. Maggie? She was gone within the month. Her house, once the epicenter of her self-made empire, was foreclosed after the HOA's financial mismanagement was exposed. She had drained the coffers dry, thinking she'd always have power, thinking she'd always be untouchable. But in the end, all she had left was a pile of lawsuits and a reputation so tarnished she couldn't show her face without someone calling her a thief. The best part? The homeowners she had scammed got their money back. After the lawsuit against Maggie concluded, a court order forced her to repay thousands of dollars in illegally issued fines. Homeowners received refund checks, some large enough to cover their mortgages for a few months. And as for Daniel, he made sure his veterans never had to worry about housing again. With the HOA out of the picture, he formally expanded his property to accommodate more veterans in need. The publicity from the news story had attracted donations, and with the help of the Veterans Organization, they built 3 more tiny homes on his land, fully equipped, fully legal, and completely untouchable by any future HOA nonsense. Jim and Carlos? They became Daniel's right-hand men, helping maintain the property and mentoring other veterans who came through. They had once been struggling to find stability, but now they had a home, a permanent one. One day, as they sat around a fire pit, enjoying the peacefulness that Maggie had once tried to destroy, Jim smirked and raised a beer. To Maggie, he said, grinning, "Wherever the hell she is now." Carlos chuckled, probably harassing some other poor neighborhood. They all laughed, but deep down, Daniel knew the truth. Maggie wasn't starting over somewhere new. She wasn't rebuilding her reign of terror in another community. She had burned too many bridges. Her name was ruined, her power was gone, and in the end, she had no one to blame but herself. As Daniel sat there, surrounded by good people, by men who had fought battles far greater than any petty HOA war, he realized something. This wasn't just about beating Maggie. This was about standing up for what was right. This was about proving that bullies, no matter how powerful they think they are, can always be taken down. And as the fire crackled, as laughter filled the air, as his once unwanted RV stood proudly in his yard, untouched and permanent, Daniel knew one thing for certain. Maggie had tried to destroy him, but in the end, she only destroyed herself. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.